Okay, I guess we have to start. Hello, everyone. My name is Samir Hasinov. Today, we have 4 presentations, and I'm going to follow the order that you see on the app. So I'm going to be first, Eugene will be next, Zushan and Selena will follow this order. I'll start my timer. Yeah. Okay, so as I mentioned, my name is Samir Hasinov. I'm a assistant professor at Auburn University, and this is joint work with my colleague, Michael Taylor, and my co-author, Charlie Martinez at University of Tennessee. Basically, in this paper, we try to understand the role of expectations in marketplace. In ag economics, we spend more time on understanding willingness to pay, right? Because it's important to understand market dynamics and how our preferences drive willingness to pay estimates. But in this paper, we take a step back. We say, okay, we know willingness to pay happens in the market when there's transaction between sellers and buyers, but what happens before the market? Because players, the sellers and buyers before market, they have some expectations. And we are trying to understand, are there any factors that affect these expectations? And can we capture some systematic biases in expectations? And our focus is on optimism bias. And we think this is important because optimism is something that it's ingrained in our culture, right? For example, famous actor Will Rogers once said, farmer has to be an optimist, otherwise he can't be a farmer, because you have uncertainties coming from market, uncertainties coming from climate and other conditions. And you have to always believe that future holds something better than today in order to be able to carry on. And we see that this life attitude has been well established in our farming communities. For example, Logan Weber, he is a farmer in Atlanta, Missouri, and he thinks that he has to be optimistic, otherwise he can't be in this business. Now, the question we ask in this paper is optimism is always better, right? Maybe there's some cases that it can be pernicious, it can affect our decisions negatively. That's our focus in this paper. And if you go back to literature, we see that optimism bias has been studied mostly in finance domain. There's some papers they show that investors who are optimistic, they're more likely to pick a stock, which is very risky investment strategy. And some papers also show that investors who are self-selecting to short-term debts, they're more likely to be optimistic. And there's also evidence that optimistic investors, they're more likely to focus on positive information. So at this stage of the literature, we have enough evidence to claim that optimism has unintended consequences for financial decision makers. In this paper, we try to extend that domain, and our focus is agriculture producers. Can we detect the same phenomena in agricultural economics setting? In this literature review, I also want to focus on these 2 papers. We base our model on this paper, Game and Economics, Economic Behavior paper by Coates. Basically, he shows that our expectations are affected by stakes. For example, let's say you go to market to buy a house, right? As a buyer, you hope that the prices will be lower than the average. If you go to market to sell house, you expect and you hope that the price will be above the average. It turns out this simple heuristic, this simple hope is sticky, and it can affect your expectations, and it's very hard to get rid of from your decision-making process. And this has been documented in lab setting by Mayra's 2018 paper. And we also have evidence that expectations can also affect our risk mitigating decisions. So if you're over-optimistic, you're less likely to buy some insurance or some future contracts, which can mitigate your risk position. Okay, so in this paper, we have 4 primary questions. The first one is, can we document optimism bias among agriculture producers? We also try to see whether optimism bias is equally prevalent in revenue and cost domains. Right? Because you can hope prices will be higher than the average because that will increase your revenue. In the same fashion, you can hope that the price of fertilizer will go down and it will drive down your costs, right? So we want to see whether this symmetry is there or not. Are you more optimistic in gain domain as well as in cost domain or loss domain? Okay, so if we see the optimism bias exist, how can we get rid of this? That's our next question. And our last question is how optimism bias affects our demand for different risk mitigating tools. Okay, so if you don't have time to stick around, these are the major results. We find that yes, optimism bias persists among agriculture producers. We also find that it's more likely to be pronounced in revenue domain. In cost domain, we don't see strong optimism bias, but in gain domain, in revenue domain, we see strong evidence that this phenomena exists. Also, we find that information helps. If you have more information about the future, about the process, about the market, you're less likely to be optimistic. That helps you to be more realistic. And also we find that if you are overconfident, that will affect your risk-taking strategies. Okay, so I will explain our predictions with a simple model. Let's say you have a product and you will sell this product in the future, but you don't know the price, right? Because prices are ambiguous. It's going to happen at T plus K, and you're at T. You want to predict the price, which is a true state, but it is unknown to you. If you overpredict or underpredict, you will have mental cost of missing the target, right? And our model predicts that if you have a noise in the information or decision process, this cost will be lower. For example, if you go to market and volatility is high, you have some crisis, and if you have a noisy decision environment, at the end of the day, you may say, oh, you know, it was so hard to predict future and I missed the target, so it's okay. So the mental cost of missing the true price will be lower if you have noise in the decision environment. Of course, if you increase the noise in absolute noisy environment, this mental cost will be flat, so you won't have any disutility of missing or over predicting the price. The optimism bias can be represented by this asymmetric shape, right? So the idea is, if I am over predicting the price, I have expected mental costs from over predicting, right? Because I know if I over predict, I will have some regret, some cognitive costs. But at the same time, when I have high expectations about the future price, I get this utility that, oh, you know, future will be great and I will get more revenue. That hope, that utility will set off some of these cognitive costs that you see. That's why the cost of over predicting will be lower than the cost of under predicting. And that will induce optimism bias. So you're more likely to be optimist because it's easier and it gives you extra utility. So that's our major prediction. Okay, so we ran 3 experiments, 2 online and 1 lab in the field experiment. The first experiment we ran at prolific.co, so which is very close to mTurk. I mean, you probably have done some mTurk studies. Basically, we recruited 180 subjects, and the participation reward was $8, and participants could earn extra $10 depending on their decisions. So we had 4 stages. In the first, of course, we had instructions. We tried to make sure that they understand this game and the experimental procedures. Then they have had 3 prediction tasks, practice tasks. And then after this stage, the third stage was 20 actual incentivized prediction tasks, and then they had exit survey. So we had 3 conditions. The first one was neutral, without any decision context. And then we had 2 role assignment, farmers and bakers. Now, let me explain you the experimental task. So in each task, we showed different price scenarios. So this is just one example. We had 20 different market trends. And we tell them, you see that the price of wheat, and basically you have ups and downs, and you are at T at this point. Can you predict the price at T plus 10? So you see the history of the price, right? And I'm asking you to predict the price at T plus 10. And these price trends we derived from ag business stocks. So we picked different like big ag business stocks, and we normalize their price trend. So these are real market data, right? This is the real stock prices. And if you hit the target price, the true price, with some allowed margin of error, in our case, it was plus minus $50, you get extra $10. Otherwise, you just get nothing. So in farmer's treatment, we said, assume that you're a farmer and you have wheat, you go to market, this is the market price. Can you predict the future price? In baker's treatment, we said, assume that you are a baker, you go to market to buy wheat, and this is the price trend. Please predict the price in the future. Okay, so this is just the balance test between treatments and control conditions. As you see, we don't find significant differences, so our randomization worked as we planned. This is our major result from the first experiment. As we see, this is a neutral condition when there is not any decision context. This is the average price predictions. But when we have baker's treatment, the average expected or predicted prices go up. And in farmer's treatment, this goes down. Right? This is actually the opposite of what we expected. Because if optimism bias persists, farmers should overpredict, right? Because they're getting revenue from their products, and bakers should underpredict. So we find actually in the general sample, the pessimism bias. Farmers are underpredicting and bakers are overpredicting. When we did subsample analysis, basically we split the sample to low risk and high risk subjects. We see that actually in low risk, we have farmers underpredicting, which is pessimism bias, but in high risk group, we have farmers overpredicting. So we concluded that actually the optimism bias is moderated with these risk preferences. It is only observed among high risk tolerant decision makers. And also we find that when we have the controls, we see that only the optimism bias is prevalent among farmers, which means that actually this bias is not symmetric. It's only observed in revenue domain. So having this result pushed us to have a second experiment with agriculture producers, because it's general sample, right? And we have low and high risk tolerant decision makers. And our expectation was that if we do this experiment with agriculture producers, we expected them to be more risk tolerant, and we should see optimism bias pronounced in that decision framework. So we did experiment 2 in Tennessee with cattle producers. We recruited 139 participants. We paid $15 as participation payment. And of course, it was again the price prediction task. If they hit the target price with allowed margin of error, we gave them extra $10. So here, what we had sellers and buyers, and also sellers with information and buyers with information. This is what we use as prediction tasks. So basically, in each task, we showed them different bull videos, right? And these are the bulls and like the data we derived from the actual market data. So these are the real bulls, and we know how much, what was the price. So we asked subjects to predict the price of the bulls. So, and also in information treatment, we gave them EPD values. Probably you don't know about EPD because before this project, I didn't have any information. Each bull has different like expected progeny differences, and these EPD tables will help cattle producers to understand, is this bull is good or bad, or like relevant to the market. So what they find is sellers overpredict and buyers underpredict, right? This is the definition of optimism bias. Remember, the questions are the same, right? And the only difference is that we assign them to different roles. In seller treatment, we ask producers to think that they are sellers. They go to market to buy bulls, and then they predict the bull prices. In the buyer's treatment, we ask them to think that they are buyers. They go to market to buy bulls. And we see that this simple role assignment, this simple framing, changed their prediction, and sellers are more likely to overpredict compared to buyers. But when we give them EPD information, the difference disappears. There's no optimism bias. So we conclude that actually optimism bias is prevalent among producers, but we can fix this problem, this bias, by providing information to decision makers. Okay, I guess I'm closer to my time limit. In the third experiment, what we did was, again, we repeated the first experiment, but in this time, we only had farmers treatment. Like you had your farmer, you have wheat, you go to market, can you, but in this case, it wasn't about the prediction. It was about, we offer you this forward contract. You see the price trend, right? You're at this point, and we offer you this contract with this price. If you want, we can buy your product at this price point. If you say yes, this is the profit you are earning. If you say no, you wait and go to market, actual market. So this is called forward contract. And we want to see if you have confidence, in which we measure their confidence. Being confident about the future, about the prices, your expectation. Does it affect your demand for this contract? And what we find is that actually the confidence, increasing confidence, reduce the demand for forward contracts. So if you are more optimistic and also more confident about the future, you are more likely to basically pass the deal and wait and go to the actual market. And basically also it increases the risk, right? Because you don't have any risk mitigating tools. You are just going to actual wild market and you're sticking to the spot market price. Okay, so this is our major results. Basically, we find that yes, optimism bias is prevalent among producers and it's important, but we can get rid of this bias by having information. And also we find that optimism bias and confidence has some relationship with the demand for risk mitigating tools. I have to stop at this point, I guess. Yeah, if you have questions, I guess I can take around 2 questions. Yes.
I really like this. It's fascinating. My question to you would be if you see some examples of this concept, optimism bias and probability sorting, pretty much the customer credit, right? So what comes to my mind is that producers might overweight the probability that the price is going to happen. So the question is, you know, do you see any integration of probability storage and optimism bias?
Yeah, that's a perfect point. We have follow-up experiment where we're trying to measure subjective probability and link that phenomena to optimism and confidence. Yeah, I believe that there should be a connection, but I haven't checked that. We haven't tested that. Yeah. Yes.
When you're reporting on this, this is the average of various trials?
Yes, it's over 20 different price scenarios. We tested that in the last experiment, which I didn't talk about because, yes, we see that some dynamic learning effect. Yeah, we have that result, but I don't have it here. But that's a good point. Yeah, we see some changes over time in different directions. Yes.
Do you think when you assign someone to be a seller, that there might be some kind of endowment effect also?
This is actually endowment effect, exactly. This is actually that comes from endowment effect, right? The psychological framing, because your seller, you know, you feel that you have hypothetical object and you predict, but actually it doesn't make sense, right? Because you don't have this object, right? It's just hypothetical. But still we see that it pushes their predictions. We give them $10, right? Extra $10 the incentive so that they can lose this attitude, but it still persists. Yeah, but it's actually an endowment effect.
But would you say that like the optimism comes from the income?
Yes, because the paper that I mentioned, called 2019, he basically links the optimism expectations to stakes. So if you have stake, which is like the endowment, and if the optimism basically aligns with the stakes, like you have property and if the price goes up, you will get higher revenue. Yes, then you're more likely to be optimistic. Okay, I have to stop. Okay, next presenter, I guess, Eugene.
Hi everybody, my name is PJ and I'm presenting the paper on behalf of the fund, Dr. Wayne and Dr. James Wadbo. And we're working on the effect of payment for ecosystem services on conservation programs, in specific the CRP program, and we are using a non-linear region switching approach. The CRP is, as I said, it's a land retirement program that was established in 1986 to retire sensitive agricultural lands from crop production into conservation for conservation purposes, right? And this program, this is the way it works. Like it's a dual process where farmers are encouraged to enroll their land in the program, and in return are giving rental payments in terms of monetary form. So this rental payments can be classified generically as payment for ecosystem services, right? And this program is meant to achieve a lot of ecological and environmental benefits, like improving upon the soil quality and trying to improve upon the wildlife factor, water quality, and also trying to reduce excess production of agricultural products onto the market, thereby trying to control crop prices. And over the years, this program has undergone a lot of changes due to various conditions like macroeconomic conditions, crop price variations, and competition from alternative land uses, because your land can be used for crop production and decide to enroll it for agricultural purposes, for conservation. And if population increases and you are near to an urban area, you can decide to convert your land for urbanization or for other development purposes based on the rents that you tend to accrue as a landowner. So we look at the spatial distribution of the rental payments and in the crop acreages over there, like the CRP acreage, that's the land that are enrolled into the program, and we see the special, like the rental payment special distribution is more centered in. Oh, sorry. What's wrong? Right. It's more centered in the Midwest, and you see the acreage are more centered in the West compared to the South. Right. So this, and we see. Over the years, we see crop prices, there's a lot of variation in crop prices over the years. From 1986 to 2020, we see a lot of variations. And if you look at from 2000 to 2005, these are periods of low crop price. So we're trying to see how, so this motivates our study. So what are we trying to do is we're trying to see how farmers react, right, during periods of low and high crop price regimes, like how are they sensitive to this program? And will farmers be willing to enroll their lands when there are high crop prices? Would they be willing to hold their lands when there are low crop prices? We're trying to see all these dynamics, right? And from the CRP literature, there's a lot of, most of these studies suffer from a lot of endogeneity issues. One, the CRP acreage and the CRP rental payments from simultaneity, right? When farmers are aware of the prices, there's that kind of demand supply, that simultaneity. And there's also that slippage effect between the CRP acreage and CRP prices. So how do you correct for all these endogeneity problems? First of all, we use what we call the Haussmann type instruments, where we use the rental payment of other counties as an instrument to control for that county. So maybe, let me use Alabama as a state. Let's say Lee County, where urban is. Right. If you are trying to instrument for Lee County, we use the averages of all other counties, excluding Lee County. And how do you, and the other method that we use is the control function method, where we use a two-stage residual inclusion strategy. This method is very important, especially when you are dealing with nonlinear modeling approaches. And we use also the PSTR model, which is the first in trying to estimate this CRP program. So in the first stage, you do what's called the linearity test. The second stage, you do a model estimation, and the third stage, you do a test of non-linearity, right? So these are our methodology that we employ for this study. So the endogeneity and the instrumental variable approach. So we specify a reduced form log land use framework as the logarithm of the CRP acreage and the rental payments, the prices and other exogenous variables with the fixed effect and the error term, right? And these are panel, right? And so we have the CRP rental payment and the CRP accurate from this endogeneity, this simultaneity issue, as I already stated. So we use the Postman type instrument to account for that. Following these papers from Econometrica, then we also use temperature data, a month and year dummies, also to instrument for the relationship between the CRP acreage and crop prices. And we use the control function to account for the nonlinear effect. So firstly, how do we do that? So we specify a CRP rental rate as this state, as the rental payment in county I in stage J at time T. It's a function of the rental payment, excluding that county being instrumented for in that state, the average of the state in that time, right? So that's how we specify our reduced form for the first stage, and we generate the residual values for the first stage, right? And we do the same thing for the crop price equation. We generate the residual values as this. Then the interesting thing about this method compared to the two-stage squares, over here you maintain the endogenous variables and you include the residual values into the model. But with the two-stage squares, you use the predicted value, then you knock off the endogenous variable. But in this stage, you include the endogenous variables and you include the residual values from the first stage to account and to correct for the endogeneity problems that are arising from the simultaneity and the slippage effect based on our model. So, and we did that because we are trying to estimate a nonlinear model. And according to Woodbridge, if you're trying to estimate a nonlinear model, this is the best approach to adopt instead of using the regular two-stage least squares approach. So in order to, so these are the regular models that are being used in the CRP studies, and so they try to use like method of movements and approach to try to control for all these endogeneity aspects. But we are trying to use a nonlinear model where we specify a nonlinear structure in a logistic form as a continuum of 0 and 1. So let's say if all this side is 0, so that means we achieve the first model, right? This model. But since our observations, I believe at a transition. So if these observations are greater than 1, then we have this nonlinear effect, and this nonlinear effect follows this logistic continuum of observations, right? And from our analysis, we saw that most of these observations are within the transition and at the upper level, closer to 1. So we are justified in using this model to conduct our research. And so the beta 1 and beta 1 plus beta 2 are the rental payment effects in the two extreme values, right? So if this side is 0, then we have this, but if this side is not equal to 0, then we have beta 1 plus beta 2, right? Where these represent the two different regimes under different crop price variations that we are trying to see. And the high crop prices and the low crop prices, what are the effects of the rental payments on the CRP, right? So that is what we are trying to establish over here. And also we will try to establish if crop prices are low and high, do farmers switch? So maybe if crop prices are low, right, okay, then I'll probably enroll my land in the CRP. If crop prices are high and lands that are already in the CRP, are farmers going to switch? Like, are farmers going to defy the conservation purposes of using their land? So we will try to establish all that using this PSTR model. So in the PSTR model, the first stage is to test the homogeneity against the PSTR alternative and try to establish if there's a regime hypothesis, like there's a regime effect, there's a switch effect. And the second stage, you demean the values, then you try to, you estimate the model using the nonlinear system. And in the third stage, you do your misspecification test to ensure that there is no remaining non-linearity in your model. So this is our data construction and our summary. So we use mainly data from the Midwest and the South for analysis from the inception of the program to 2019. And we obtained data from the CRP acreage and the CRP rental rates are obtained from the FSA. And we use other county level data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the USDA. So we constructed population density, and we use median household income as well. Then for our price index, we use the county level crop production and deflated state prices to construct a last PS price index, right? But for other stuff, we did a partial price index as well, but we didn't include it in our analysis over here. So we did a correlation, and we saw that there's a high correlation between our partial price index and the last year's price index. So we decided to go with the partial, with the last year, sorry. And we also, to account for temperature, we also got data from the PRISM data, like the PRISM data set to account for the effect of temperature on CRP, right? So these are the map of our study area. So we focus more on the Midwest and the southern part of the United States. And these are the distributed statistics of our variables that we used. And the PSC estimation, in the first stage, what you're supposed to do is to test and see if there actually exists this regime switch. So we did that, and we saw that the null hypothesis was rejected, and we saw there exists a regime switch. So we went ahead with our estimate, and according to the developers of this model, you need to test to see if your logistic function, like the transition periods. So we chose 1, and because we also rejected the hypothesis for that, we saw that 1 was a good enough transition pattern to estimate our regime switch model. So we chose m is equal to 1. So this is our results. So we see that in the first period, when under low crop prices, right, when we see the effect of the rental payments on the CRP is 0.28, right? But when you account for this regime switch and periods of high crop prices, we see the effect decreases to 0.20 being accounted for this, right? So this is what is missing in the CRP literature, right? So we see that farmers are very sensitive to crop price variations, but how do we do that? And looking at the CRP literature, nobody has even, they've not been able to explicitly account for that. So we believe this is a very good contribution to the CRP literature, because we see the sensitivity of farmers differ at varying crop price effects, at varying crop price transitions. And we established that there's about 8% decrease, there'll be an 8% decrease in enrollments, right? If crop prices are extremely high, right? So this is like pictorial view of our results, and we see that in periods of high crop prices, we see that the effect is quite stable. The payment effect or the rental effect is stable. Although it's positive, it's stable. But you see periods when there are low crop prices, that is from 2000 to 2005, we see the payment effects, it shoots up, it increases, right? It increases. So that shows that farmers are very sensitive to the payment effect when crop prices are very low. So they tend to want to enroll more land into a program. But when crop prices are low, they are insensitive. Like when crop prices are high, they are insensitive to the CRP program, right? And so we decided to see at what point will farmers want to switch from using their land for conservation, switch between that alternative use of land for conservation as against agricultural production. Then we saw that the transition takes place at the lower ends of the transformed crop price index. So you can see that when the crop price index is increasing, the effects at higher crop prices, any additional land you added onto the program wouldn't have any effect because farmers are insensitive to the program. But when crop prices are low, that is when you see farmers really reacting. So, and this is very important for policy, right? And as you can see here also. Okay, right, I'm already done. So this is our conclusion. And so we conclude that the CRP rental effect on CRP acreage differs under different crop prices regimes and show the relationship between the rental rates and the CRP acreage. We show that it's non-linear and it's L-shaped in nature, as you can see here. And also we exploit the regime switch effect. And so for policy, what we're trying to say is, if this works two ways, if the operators of the CRP are trying to conserve money or they're trying to save money, then policy implications must be done at the point where must be done at these periods where crop prices are so low, because, sorry, that is where we find the responsiveness. But if crop prices are high and farmers have that opportunity to use the land for other stuff, and you're trying to give them more money, it wouldn't have any effect unless you increase the money to a very high point. But if crop prices are low and farmers already have that kind of sense that they have that edge to enroll their land, then you can decide to maybe probably decrease rental rates, because farmers are still reactive, they are still going to enroll anyways. Or probably you can, if you want to achieve a certain threshold of environmental quality, you can increase a little bit to whip up their interest to enroll more lands when crop prices are low. But when crop prices are high, when we find no effect, then we feel farmers are very insensitive to the program. Yes. So thank you.
The CRP has an acreage cap instead of farm bills, and it changes, and the time has been essentially buying renewable acres for a program. And it was a 10 to 15-year goal that was come up for expiration every year, as acres coming down. And so, looking at this total goal, that I don't know if you're going to get really sensitivity here. You have acres coming out, so you have a different size of allowable acres each year. I would also see that 2018 farm there was some changes in the funding formulas that were used more recently changes again. So we really see a lot of different regimes in CRP, and we also see change the type of CRP. We have like grasslands, level continuous, and general working land programs. Does this fit in this regression?
So this first of all, this is a continuous sign up. It's continuous sign up, yes. And secondly, if I get a question right on the cap, right, variation control for cap. So probably we know the cap, like it stables, it goes up, it comes down. Like, and for the past 5 or 6 years, the caps are coming down. So we have to like control for caps as well to try to improve the steadiness. Yes. So that's what I think we'll do that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zhu Shan from Iowa State University. This is the joint work with Dr. Hongli Feng on how carbon payment schemes affect farmers' choice of conservation practice and policy efficiency analysis. So carbon sequestration accounts for 12% of US total carbon emission in 2019, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. And studies have showed that many agricultural conservation practices can help to sequester carbon, but this conservation practice are usually adopted to improve the water quality and to reduce soil erosion. So the positive externality of carbon sequestration hasn't been valued properly in the past few years. Here's examples like how effective this conservation practice. For example, cover crop can reduce greenhouse emission by 0.2 to 0.9 tons of carbon dioxide per acre per year, and the no-till can reduce greenhouse emission by up to 1.2 tons of carbon dioxide. And under the big background of Biden's goal to reduce the net carbon emission, there has been growing interest and a tremendous amount of money has flowed into the agricultural conservation practice. For example, the federal government is investing up to $1 billion to support the climate smart agriculture and forestry. And the other private programs like Tutela has paid farmers more than $4 billion in the past year for sequestering over 200,000 metric tons of carbon. Besides Tutela, there are many other voluntary programs that has been expanding rapidly. Broadly speaking, there are two types of program. The first one is what we know as practice-based. It offers farmers a fixed payment per acre to enroll in the program. And the second one is what we call performance-based. The incentive payment is based on the amount of carbon that farmer actually sequestered. For example, Tutela and Indigo offers farmers $15 to $25 per tons of carbon that has been sequestered. Besides private programs, like government programs such as EQIP offers the practice-based payment. For example, EQIP offers $33 for basic cover crop scenario. So our general research question is that which carbon payment is more efficient? This question has been extensively studied in the literature. The practice-based payment is also we call input-based or action-based. Is very simple and easy to implement, but the information symmetry will make designing the cost-effective payment system quite challenging. So it is generally believed that the performance-based, also we called outcome-based, is to be more cost-effective, showed in many literatures. But the comparative advantage will decrease with the increasing variation of conservation cost. And when the information rents and adverse selection exist, White and Henley showed that the input-based contracts performs even more better. Besides the carbon payment that will affect farmers' choice of participating in the carbon program or not, the decision theory that they are referring to also make very important impact. Well, in the payment for ecosystem service context, it's quite common to assume that farmers to choose production inputs and the conservation practice to maximize their expected profit. Well, as we all know that the farmer's risk attitude will affect the choice of input usage and the decision-making quite significantly. Since adopting the conservation practice can carry the risk of decreased yield, risk-averse farmers will need more financial assistance to participate in the program. And also previous classic theoretical has showed that when the risk aversion is taken into account, farmers will choose less input, as well as choose to whether to participate or not. So what we did is to start from the farmer's perspective, and we derive farmer's decision rule under different scenarios, and we plug the farmer's decision rule into the carbon bias problem, which only who care about the environmental benefits, and then we simulate the policy efficiency. So in this section, I will briefly go through the production technology. The production function is assumed to be Gx1 and x2. x1 is the composite input, and x2 is what we care about, the discrete conservation choice. We assume it follows multiplicative form, that is lambda x2 times Gx1. Lambda x2 is the yield impact. We assume it to be a constant. If you choose to, it can be greater than 1 or less than 1. Greater than 1 means that adopting the conservation may increase the yield. Otherwise, it will decrease the yield. And the carbon sequestration function is assumed to be neta plus n stochastic disturbance epsilon times x2. Neta represents farms' productivity of carbon sequestration, which will vary from farms like land and soil condition. And the stochastic disturbance is the uncertainty that is mainly affected by the weather. Excuse me. It is identically and independent and identically normal distributed with zero mean and the standard deviation. Has a standard deviation of sigma. Thanks. The farmer has to pay for price factor omega for the composite input, and he can sell the crop at price PCR on the market. And the marginal implementation cost is assumed to be B. So here's the farmer's profit under two payment schemes. The first one, payment scheme A, is the practice-based payment. The profit is composed with the revenue that comes from the crop production. AX2 is the carbon payment. A is the payment per acre minus the input cost and the implementation cost. The profit under payment scheme B is different only in the carbon payment term. That is price of carbon times the carbon sequestration function. So in the next section, I derive the farmer's decision on the different scenarios. So under expected profit maximization for payment scheme A, to summarize, if the payment per acre A is greater than the cost, then the farmer will choose to adopt. That is the case that we do not consider the yield impact. Why we say that? Because we assume the carbon buyer only care about the environmental benefits. We use carbon buyer instead of social planner because social planner care about the production side. But in our case, it's not. We focus on the environmental benefits. And for payment scheme B, if the expected carbon benefit is greater than the cost, then the farmer will choose to adopt. Since we assume no uncertainty in payment, the practice-based payment, the solution to the X1 and X2 is same as the expected profit maximization, but there is uncertainty exists in the carbon payment under the performance-based payment. We all know that due to the curvature of the utility function, the risk-averse farmers will need more money that will lead to the same level of adoption. So we derive the certainty equivalent of the profit that will make the farmers indifferent of participating the program or not. Then we calculate the risk premium. That is the extra turn that will help farmers to adopt the conservation practice. So the decision rule under EU is that if the expected carbon payment is greater than the implementation cost plus the risk premium, then the farmer will choose to adopt. The next step is the carbon buyer's problem. So we assume that the carbon buyer knows the certain distribution of farmers' parameters, such as the implementation cost, the carbon sequestration productivity. And under payment scheme A, we assume the goal of carbon buyer is to maximize the acres that erode in the program. So what the carbon buyer will do is he will rank the farmer with the lowest cost to the highest cost. Then he will select the farmers with the lowest cost until the budget is exhausted. So here is one implicit assumption, that is the total carbon budget is not big enough to cover everybody. And for payment scheme B, the things will be a little bit different. Like the ranking for the performance-based payment, the carbon buyer's goal is to maximize the amount of carbon that has been sequestered. And under expected profit, the ranking criteria is to rank the farmer with the lowest cost per unit of carbon credit to the highest. Then he select until the budget is exhausted. And under the EU, because there is a risk premium term here, so what he will do is rank by the cost plus the premium divided by the total carbon sequestration. Then he select from lowest to the highest. So here is the simulation result based on the case of cover crops. So let's look at the first graph, which is very important. The blue line represents the practice-based payment, and the green line is the performance-based payment with risk aversion is considered, and the red line is the performance-based under expected profit maximization. We can see from the first graph is that the practice-based payment will sequester less carbon under expected profit maximization, which is the red line. But it is less cost effective when the farmer's risk aversion is considered, because we have to pay farmer extra money. And the second graph is the optimal price under different settings. This delivers the similar message with the first one, because the total carbon sequestration times the optimal price will equal to the carbon budget, because everyone faces the same price. And the third one is number of farmers that will be eroded. The green line represents the performance-based with risk aversion. It has the highest price, so it will erode less amount, the smallest amount of farmers. Although the practice-based can erode the largest amount of farmers, but it cannot erode the most productive ones, so it will sequester less carbon than the red line. So in conclusion, we start from the farmer's decision-making progress, and we analyze the decision rules under different scenarios, and then we plug into the carbon bias problem, and we simulate the environmental and economic impacts of these carbon payment schemes. So what we found is that the performance-based payment outperforms the practice-based payment under profit maximization, but the practice-based payment is more cost-effective when farmers' risk aversion is considered. So we can say that if we only conclude a best and benefit and the cost analysis when evaluating the program participation, it will lead to an overly optimistic case in terms of environmental and economic impacts. And here are some future work. First, relaxing the restrictive assumptions will lead to more robust conclusions, such as the convex cost function, the alternative utility function, non-zero marginal conservation effects, and we're probably gonna integrate with ecosystem model that will help us to be more close to the realistic case. And we are also considering broaden our decision series, such as cumulative prospective theory. The probable weighting and the reference point and the curvature, the loss aversion will make farmer even less willing to participate in the program under the CPT. And we are also thinking about the ambiguity aversion, and we are trying to see whether adopting the conservation will how it will change the distribution of the yield to see whether it will increase the ambiguity or not. So this is what I have. Thanks.
So there's quite a bit of difference between outcomes-based, practice-based as far as implementation. In reality, practice-based is very simple to monitor, verify, use, sell data. Outcomes-based takes a lot of measure it. For example, the farmer has to turn everything. So there's very high reservation costs for farmers who don't necessarily put the turnover goal. And so whenever they look at this decision that future reporting mechanisms that be very important to add in is some of that reservation costs for compliance with the monitoring of the performance.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like what the carbon program do is that you apply for the carbon program, then they go to your farm and test your soil sample and test it and estimate your carbon sequestration. The cost is quite large, so this is definitely what we will consider in the future work.
And what we want to measure actually is that your trainer's program is just you enroll in a practice group. That's it. Yeah, all the rest of them are.
The buyer carbon. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Mm. Okay. We did put it here, right?
Yeah, it should.
I don't see it though. Oh yeah, maybe that's a better way to go. You're right. Nope, actually I still. Okay. Sorry, everybody. Oh yeah, here we go. Thank you. So, let's get everybody on Zoom on board. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for staying for this final presentation. This work is a work in progress, and I'm pretty much here to just pick your mind because we have a room full of experts here. And I'm together with Professor Oliver Mussow and Daniel Herrmann, I'm working on this method and we're somehow stuck. So my goal for this presentation is to pretty much just get you on board or where we're stuck. And maybe one of you has a good idea on how to continue this method. So the title of this presentation is gamification a curse or blessing for the design of risk elicitation methods in the field? And it's experimental evidence from Cambodian smallholder farmers. So spoiler, it's both. From what we've seen, gamification can be a curse and a blessing in the design of these methods. And to set the stage, the motivation of this study and the problem somewhat is that we're still somehow on the search for reliable instruments to measure risk attitudes when we're looking at non-weird subjects, so or low numeracy subjects. And the approach that we're taking here is that we developed a wheel task, as we call it. It's a method that we thought of, and we hold it against the Holt-and-Lowry and the Doman to see what it yields. And what we find is that we have low consistencies across tasks. I think that's something we see with a lot of risk elicitation methods, despite if they're new or not. But what we see and what's particularly interesting is that we have a very high noise in the Holt-and-Lowry method, but not in the wheel task that I'm going to present to you now. And we think that this might be due to the enthusiasm from gambling, that people are rather attentive, but that this enthusiasm from gambling or from this gamification effect, on the other hand, overestimates the risk behavior. Okay, I hope I raised your interest. I can tell from all of your exciting faces. So let's start with the motivation again. We touched upon this in the other talks, but basically we all know that risk aversion, and we just heard it in the talk before, is that risk aversion is quite important for a lot of different things. We can look at it in a, let's say, vicious cycle of poverty, and to understand the risk attitude is important because we can, once we know it, we can introduce some kind of risk coping mechanism, such as introduce seats with insurance schemes for particularly risk-averse individuals. So now the question is just, how do we measure risk attitudes accurately? And one example is the Holt-and-Lowry lottery, which a lot of you probably know. I'm going to show it to you in a second. It's popular because it's accurate, and we see very low inconsistency rates among, well, high educated populations, roughly 10%, so pretty much nothing. But when we go to non-weird subjects or low numeracy subjects, we see that they're way higher, 41% in South Africa in a study here, or 50% Rwanda, in our case, 70% in Cambodia. So what do we have? What's the toolbox we have to measure risk attitudes? Here are a number of tasks that are typically used, right? And there's a taxonomy here, so we go from complex to simple, and the way they are incentivized. So does this work? Yeah. We have, for example, rather complex tasks, so the binary lotteries, such as the Holden Lorry lottery, but we also have simpler tasks that can include numeric, so some kind of numbers, such as in the Gnisi-Potter's task, where I ask you to invest a certain amount of money, right? And you can invest it in a very safe investment or a highly risky investment, and then I just look how you distribute your money. Or we can look at, for example, the BART, the balloon task, which is very simple and non-numeric, where we ask the individual to blow up a balloon, and there's some kind of popping point. If you reach that point, you lose all your money, right? So we have very different tasks, actually. Or we can just ask what's your risk attitude on a scale from 0 to 10 or 1 to 10, right? Yet the problem that remains for a researcher who wants to go, let's say, to rural Cambodia and understand risk preferences, is that he or she needs to find a method or needs to illustrate a method in a way that it reduces noise, it is accurate, and that it is feasible for the field. So these are the pretty much the three parameters you're looking for when you're looking for your method, right? And this is still an ongoing quest, because while, for example, the Holden Lorry is particularly accurate, you might only measure noise because people don't understand it. So you have two options. You cannot use it, or you have to think about a really smart way how to illustrate it to reduce your noise so that people understand it. Or you can use, for example, the Gnisi-Potter's technique I just presented, where you ask the individual to invest something. You probably get a rather accurate result, but you can't really say, you can't, for example, calculate the expected utility curvature that you want to have, right? So we don't have the accuracy we're looking for. And then you need something for the field. So for example, in rural Cambodia, we had the main problem that we couldn't use the balloon task as a digital task on a tablet, because we have the bias of the tablet, and a lot of people didn't want to use it, couldn't use it, simply because of the thick skin they had on their fingers because of all the work they do in the field. But to really get the effect from gamification, you need to push this button and really feel the threat of this balloon popping, right? So that's what I mean with feasible. So we're still looking for these three parameters when we're looking at a method. And what we're asking here with our method is, can incorporating an element of gamification in a precise risk elicitation measure be beneficial for the risk analysis among low numeracy subjects? Okay, how do we do it? We use this wheel task, which we pretty much just came up with. So it looks really like this. We bought this wheel from Amazon at $24. And then we made these 6 or 7 shapes for it, okay? And I'm gonna present to you how it looks like. I'm gonna come back to that. So this is how we designed the wheel task, and it's pretty much based on the Holden Lorry task. So we designed this CRA values such that they are comparable with what we see in the Holden Lorry. And what we have in our original case is we play it in 6 rows. And I'm just going to turn over to the illustration, okay? Because this is exactly how I do it in the field. So we start with round 1, and you always have the chance, you can always choose between $1 or playing the wheel with me, okay? I will spin the wheel so that you see how it works, okay? I've done that, you've all seen how it works. If this point here hits a white area, you get 5 cents. But if it hits the blue area, you get $2.50, okay? So do you want to go for the safe game, $1, or do you want to spin the wheel with me? Okay, this is pretty much the choice you have to make. Okay, round 2, same thing, $1 or 5 cents in the white area, $2.50 in the blue area. $1 here, or in the white area, you see 50-50, $2.50 in the blue area, 5 cents here. Okay, and now you got the idea, so I'm going to show you this. So it's always $1 safe versus 5 cents up until round 5 versus $2.50 up until round 5. Sorry. And then in this last round, what we did after a very extensive pilot is we switched the white area to $1 too. So in this last round, I'd ask you, okay, Now please listen, we go for $1 safe, or the blue area is $2.50 versus if it hits the white area, it's $1. Now you might ask, I see some frowning faces, why? And the reason being is that we saw in the pilot, which we conducted among, I think, 60 individuals, that people either only go for the $1 or they only go for the wheel. And so what we wanted to do with this last round is we wanted to see, okay, is there somebody who just wants to play, right? Because in this scenario, it makes no sense to take the $1. You're always better taking the wheel, right? And then what we did later on is if somebody just took the $1, we asked them, do you do this because of cultural reasons? Because that was our main idea why people would do it. Okay, so this was version 1, but what we saw is that people still only went for the wheel, okay? And so we introduced a second task with over 100 participants, where we introduced a new round 1. And here you see, again, $1 against, you can get 5 cents for to 90%, or $1 to 10%. So this is somehow the opposite of the last row. So here the dominant option would be to go for the $1, right? So here we wanted to see, are there people who just want to play, right? Are there people who just want to play? And turns out there are people who just want to play. So we find later on that roughly 50% of these 100 people choose the wheel in round 1. Okay, and this is also the problem that I'm gonna come towards. So what we did is that this version 1 and version 2 was played between subjects. As I said, we started off with 120 individuals. Then we realized we need to control for this gamification problem. So then we redesigned it and we played this thing with, again, 100+ individuals. So these were between subject, but they were always held against the Holt and Laurie and the Doman, okay? So just to complete the story, the Holt and Laurie looks like this, right? For those of you who haven't seen it, so it's quite similar. We have 10 rounds, and it's usually demonstrated to the participant, worst case like this, right? Like as this table, and you always choose lottery 1 or 2 per row, or you use, for example, balls or some kind of like some kind of demonstration for sure. And then, yeah, okay. So we did this in rural Cambodia, northeastern Cambodia, and 16 villages with about 250 smallholder farmers. So what do we see? This is an overview of our descriptive statistics. What's maybe interesting here is basically the risk measurement results. So for the Doman, we see that on average, the participants answer with a 5, leaning towards a 6. So we have a risk neutral answering behavior in the Doman question. And then we looked at the inconsistencies in the Holt and Laurie task and the wheel task. And that means that people switch more than once in these tasks, because what we usually want to see is people go for the safe option for some rows, and then they switch over to the risk-seeking role, or they don't do it at all, stay in A, or only go for B, right? But if we see some mishmash of this decision behavior, we call it inconsistency, right? So this is what we see in the Holt and Laurie. We see 70% inconsistency rate, which is extremely high relative to other studies. And in the wheel test, we see 28%. So among the same study group, it's significantly lower. Okay, now here we have an overview of the, am I still good in time? Here we have an overview of the safe choices. Let's first look at these 3 in the Holt and Laurie task. So in round 1, we see that like a lot of individuals start roughly 80% with option A, and then we see a rather downward pattern. That's pretty much what we expect. In the wheel task, we see that the individuals start at a very lower level with choosing the safer option, so at 50% roughly, and then it goes down with more people choosing the riskier option in round 6, and that's pretty much, that's the shape we want to see, right? We want to see this consistent pattern. In wheel task 2, it doesn't really look like that. We see a slight peak again in round 3, so people go pretty much from safe to risky to safe. That's the pattern we see here, so it's not as nice and smooth as we want to see it. For the Doman decisions, this is the cumulative decision pattern, and that's pretty much what we expect. We see we see an upward trend, and that's what we want to have, and it makes sense because around 5 is our average. Okay, but maybe this is more interesting and makes more sense for our brainstorming that's going to follow. So when we look at the Holt and Laurie results, we see that the majority of our answers are risk averse. So we would, if we just had this in the way we played it with these 250 farmers, the results of our study were the farmers in our sample are in general risk averse. Okay. If we had the results from our wheel test taken together, we would say the majority of the farmers are risk seeking. If we had the results from the Doman, we would say we have risk neutral to risk seeking farmers. Okay, so we have little consistency across tasks, but we heard it this morning as well in the other session. That's what we see in a lot of studies. The interesting thing is just what kind of inconsistency we see. We see this risk averse behavior here, but remember we have a lot of noise, but we see this extremely risk seeking tendency here. And if we look at, this is now the wheel task by study. So this is version 1, and this is version 2. The version 2 where I introduced this additional row 1, right? Saying that, yeah, pretty much it's irrational to choose the wheel. And what we see is when we introduce that row, it gets even worse, right? We have even more risk-seeking behavior. Okay, so what do we draw from this? These risk measures are not concordant in their answers, but what we see is that while this gamification effect, I don't even know if I have this picture here, but we have way better pictures. Actually, I just couldn't find them. Like the enthusiasm we had in the villages when we played these games, they were good and bad, right? We have all of the attention, but especially in this setting, it was just way too much attention. And there was pretty much no way to control for it. Like everybody was chanting and really happy and screaming what to do, go for blue, you know, so it's fun. It was a lot of fun. But it's very dangerous for our risk attitude measurement to keep it accurate and neat, right? So it was, but then when you play the Holt and Laurie, you feel like the person in front of you is falling asleep, right? And then they just say AAEA or something, right? So both have their problems. And now the question is, what do we do? So that's why I say here, the blessing of gamification, I believe, and we see that in the BART task, in the bomb task, for example, in the balloon task, for example, in the literature, we see that it does raise attention and engagement. But the curse, especially probably when we go for a lab in the fields, is that the potential measurement error, which comes from the utility just from playing the game, right? And instead of measuring risk attitude, what we measured is, do you want to play a game with me or not? We didn't measure, are you risk-taking or not? So now the question is, how do we go forward? And we have a few ideas how to control for gamification. So the first one is, maybe the first step could be to include external measures for external validity. So we could say, okay, let's see if those who are extremely risk-seeking in the wheel task, do they have a particularly interesting or innovative crop portfolio, right? But the problem in our sample is the farmers are very homogeneous. So there's not a lot we can look at. The second idea is to use two wheels. To use two wheels, and let's say, let's have wheel against wheel, right? Then we control for the gamification because there's no opt-out. You have to play with me, or you say, I don't want to play the game at all because of maybe cultural obligations, right? Another idea is to illustrate the Holt and Laurie task with the wheels. So maybe we don't even need a new task. Maybe we just need to illustrate something that's good and that we already have in a better way. So why not try that? Or, and that's something I would really like to do, is to just work with one wheel. Just have one wheel and maybe say, okay, we have this game. What's your certainty equivalent you would pay for playing this game, right? So to ask somebody to pay for it. Or maybe there are other ideas, and that's where you come in. And I thank you very much for your attention and happy to hear your thoughts. Yeah. Yeah, they were, it was more than, it was, because it was $3.50 just for joining the game. And then it was the additional win on top. And that was more than a whole working day of income. So I think the stakes were okay. But would you suggest to raise them a bit to see what happens? Yeah. 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 Yeah, sure. Right. 5 to 95, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, and basically, you don't distort the sequence, right? 5 cents. And then we have this, the last one, right? You got to be clear.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have high stakes and same low state. But switch it to the point, yes, because I have this number. And we have this one number. Since that we're missing that.
Yeah, yeah, interesting thought. You think so? But exactly, yeah.
Just spins and but that's kind of control of this excitement.
Yeah, I think so too. The only thing I thought is if you have two, it gets confusing again. That would be my take, but I think it's worth a try. That's true. Or maybe you could even make it colorful, say no matter what color, it's $1. Then you can at least see the colors. Yeah. Exactly. So that's why we did this long pilot. So what happens is before anything happens, the participants have to decide before we spin the wheel. And then when it happens, that's where the party starts. So exactly. Exactly. And you can't really control I mean, it's very difficult in the field to control for somebody coming in, discussing with you, already spinning the wheel. I think that's it, yeah. I think so, yeah. You have some kind of peer effect, but then, I mean, that's why we do the lab in the field, right? If some decision comes up in this kind of setting, the person wouldn't make this decision by herself. It wouldn't be so popular and noisy, but still we have our peers to come and consult us. So I think that's exactly why we do the lab in the field stuff, right? Because we have this natural influence. So yeah, that's what we're trying to our best extent. So yeah, but good point. I mean, the peer point is important. I totally agree. Sorry, Alexis? Yeah, we did, but we don't. That's why also I don't have a fancy table at the end. We looked at all kinds of combination that could maybe serve as an explanation, but we don't have anything yet. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Mm.
We should expect to see more discoveries. That's why we have readers in the summer. So that's why I guess open learning seems most of the main society, right? Like you should expect to see discoveries. In your case, you have 4%, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So like which one is more realistic?
24.
You know any distributional studies that
yeah, I mean, there are many, right? That's the thing. You read so many studies where you say in tendency, smallholder farmers are risk averse. right? And then you can distribute it by gender again, where females are more risk averse than men, right? Yeah, but it's aggregate, exactly. To me, personally, no, because from my perspective, when I see the farmers, even though they're rather homogeneous in their crop portfolio, I find them as risk seeking because the work they're doing and the risk they're exposed to, like you really have to be very bold to do this kind of work from my perspective, but maybe it's not from their perspective. So I couldn't say which one I find more realistic because the literature says we would rather expect risk averse individuals. My personal guts tell me these people are very risk seeking. I couldn't give an answer to that. Yeah, we have the Weber scale too, but we didn't include it here. We could include it as well to see the domains and what happens in the domains. Yeah, that's true. There was another idea, but yeah.
So this is a within.
Yeah.
And did you change the ordering there?
Yeah, we randomized the order.
So have you looked at the correlation of risk classifications?
I think yes, but we didn't find anything. Like there's really no pattern that we see.
And how are we planning to do with the risk preference data? What's the analysis?
That we have. We did that's why I also showed the cognitive capacity here. So with the Holden-Lowry and the cognitive skills, so we did a cognitive test as well. We developed a study where we look at the inconsistencies, which are rather high, and if we can explain them through the level of cognitive skills. So the wheel task is really a personal endeavor I'm doing in addition to it to see if we can compare them and see what if it makes sense to adjust it somewhat.
Do you have choice data that you can analyze, like some adoption, technology adoption or something like that?
Well, we have inputs, for example, like if the individual is using fertilizer or some kind of irrigation technology.
My thought was what you can do possibly is take your disparate results and put it as covariates to see if they explain risky behavior.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So to do it, yeah, that's a good idea. That's what I thought too, but I think that way is good too. Yeah. Yes, we do. Can calculate. It's the second one, can calculate. I should name it numeracy, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. I think we're over time, but this was super interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much.